Yep, we pretty much are good. So thank you.
Cool, thank you. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. So honestly, some of O is a bit whack. Number one, the simulation stuff on COVID modeling, etc., is either not mutually exclusive, or I think OG disproves why people would actively choose to experience oppression. But secondly, is the discussion on the restrictions of geographic discrimination that are put upon you are only built insofar as you can maybe have a long-distance relationship. I will explain why oftentimes the community you are born in often determines educational and social outcomes for you for a very, very, very large likelihood. And I'll explain as a consequence why moving and going into online worlds is far better. The first thing I want to do, however, is rebut this whole idea of regulation. The first thing I want to say is there are nuanced mechanisms from OG, but not necessarily nuanced conclusions. I.e., they say that you can have increased ability to pattern people's behavior, the kinds of speech that they use. They don't explain why these are additionally useful in being able to rig elections when those are normally determined by preference. And therefore, this is not a big change in how much this harm is likely to accrue on either side. But secondly, Facebook or Metaverse is only good insofar as it has network effects. I.e., if not all of your friends, all of your family are on this platform, it's not very fun or good for you. And therefore, widespread societal buy-in is a prerequisite to any kind of successful Metaverse, and therefore is likely to cater to the consensus needs of everybody. But thirdly, is that because it is a long-term project, not only do you need that buy-in, but you need a consensus of many different people, right? People within governments who are likely to use this for their own social programs, many different corporations you're going to need because Facebook isn't just Facebook. You need to have AI, you need to have augmented reality and many other things. And therefore prove this isn't likely to be as abusive as they pointed out to be. I want to first explain, however, why you're likely to ensure better social services and their provision. And for the same reasons that open and government explain, the metaverse is likely to feature a lot of things that depend on interaction-based social services. I.e., you're likely to move classrooms to the metaverse in the same way a lot of public schools in developing countries already use Facebook as a main means of communication. You're likely to bring doctors online. You're likely to ensure that you move offices to the virtual world for the same reasons of profit, to be able to interact with whatever lucrative government contracts or interactions with private companies that the metaverse is likely to bring. Why is this important? The first thing I want to say is that you're often constrained to the neighborhood you're born in. Because if you're in a district that is historically gerrymandered, if you live in a rural community, if your kid will probably end up in a bad school that doesn't have much funding. If you encounter an accident, the nearest hospital could potentially be 2 to 3 hours away from wherever you need to be able to access. Why does the metaverse make things better? The first thing I want to say is that the logistical constraints makes all of these things so much worse. Traffic and congestion that make the ability for us to go to work, make and lose billions of dollars in productivity on a daily basis. Overcrowding in public schools because you don't have a sufficient amount of physical space, and therefore forces 80 students to one classroom. I would note that a lot of these things are solved by not anymore being constrained to the physical funding and the physical boundaries of a space that cannot contain a specific number of people and therefore are much more likely to be fixed on our side of the house. Secondly, even if they don't improve in specific areas, it is the breaking down of geographic boundaries such that if only capital cities had good hospitals, at the very least now you can teleconsult with a doctor face to face. And not only that, maybe they have more realistic scans of your body that they needed to be able to see and you can't do right now on Zoom, and therefore makes these kinds of services far better. But thirdly, is that with this increased amount of, or rather, with the same amount of capital, you no longer have to spend it up on buying land. You no longer have to spend it up on physically building structures. This is much more likely to go to productive human labor, and therefore, schools that had limited and scarce resources to begin with can now invest in better teachers instead of trying to build up new facilities for the school because of the lack of the need for physical spaces anyway. I'd argue this is a huge benefit because you are no longer constrained to the neighborhoods and areas in which you reside. Secondly, identity. Opening government says there are many real-life interactions that are more meaningful. I think opening opposition just says there's an empathy gap that is bridged. So what I want to say in extension is that for the most vulnerable groups, it is the physical space that constrains you from being able to access these identity-forming kinds of avenues. Because if you are Black and you live in a rough neighborhood, you are not only fearing the violence that exists outside, you fear the potential confrontation you might reach with a policeman in the instance you choose to go out. If you are a woman, you will be told not to go out at night because of things that could possibly happen. Why is it far better on our side of the house when you only exist within this physical, or rather, metaverse as a consequence? The first thing I want to say is, I just don't think Mark Zuckerberg is going to be dumb enough to allow you to feel incredibly dangerous and awful things. And therefore, the lack of a physical threat is much more likely to ensure you are able to access these avenues. But if you don't believe the first thing, it is at the very least the increased amount of control and agency you have over which spaces you're able to access without your parents being able to monitor wherever you're going and knowing you're at a late night out and therefore will shame you if you ended up going to a gay bar. It is you no longer having to step outside to a neighborhood that is filled with crime, that is filled with violence, and therefore you feel more safe in being able to engage in these identity-forming behaviors. And what I'd note here is that this is much more important whenever empathy gap exists on opening opposition, because not only do I think it's a wash thus far, we think the participation and the ability to access these avenues to begin with are the prerequisite and a priori analysis to prove any kind of empathy gap existing as a consequence. I'd explain, therefore, the present and physical threat that people often face, not only as a physical form of violence, but because of the people they might encounter, the ways in which they might get found out, and the ways in which they are constrained not only by their identity, but being born to a conservative home or a rough neighborhood, are much more likely to be dangerous for them. Lastly, I want to talk about addiction, and not just say it's mutually exclusive, but say in fact that addiction is much worse on government side of the house. Before I move on, I'll take OG.
You cannot get treated at a fake hospital because it is not your actual body. This is just consultation. There are phone consultation status quo. In areas with a lot of space constraints, worst case, there are phone calls, Zoom education, and online learning systems.
So I literally just gave the nuance for that. If you're able to better physically scan your body, if a doctor needs to be able to check you up and can't do so on a camera on Zoom, it is far better able for them to do that. You also don't respond to the classrooms, you don't respond to work and office meetings, and therefore it's just still a wide-standing benefit. Thirdly, on addiction. In fact, I'd say addiction is worse on gov, because when you are constrained to not being able to build realistic and meaningful interactions with other people, the way that Facebook facilitates addiction is instant gratification. So things like the likes that you have, the need to be able to view people's stories. When I'd argue on our side of the house, they can keep you on the platform by just surrounding you with the people that you like interacting with. But the fact that you can go to your friend's house without actually having to go there. I know that similar platforms like Discord, like Zoom, don't have to keep you on the platform through any addictive means. I actually am very not addicted to Zoom as of the moment, but it is the ability for me to know that maybe I have to go to school on this platform, or that I am able to connect with friends, create meaningful connections on these platforms because they are much better simulations of real life interaction than Facebook is. It makes it much less likely for them to have any kinds of destructive and dangerous forms of addiction that are being forced upon you. Instead of, on the comparative where Facebook still exists on their side, these small instances in which you engage that are not actually meaningful and realistic, where you're forced to have instant gratification as the main means of addiction, is far worse. I'm very proud to oppose.
All right, thank you very much. I now like to invite the Gov Whip to conclude the Gov case. Here.
Cool, can you hear me?
Yep.
Fantastic. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, debaters love making bold arguments, and while these are intellectually stimulating and interesting, they're not necessarily winning. Both ideas from the opening opposition as well as from the closing opposition say that there is nothing wrong. About addiction. We think that this idea is really messed up. They literally say it is so immersive, so engaging, that there's so many great experiences you have that we should basically allow it. The only metric they give for that is that you can decide if you want to use it, if it is going to be net positive for you at the end. The whole problem is that your thinking is so impaired, and I flagged that in my POI, that you cannot make this decision in an informed way. The consequences of this type of addiction are so much worse. People will be so hooked into this that A, it will make it incredibly difficult to regulate, which is our first substantial contribution. Second, they will make really bad decisions for themselves, focusing on virtual lives rather than the real ones, even though their very existence, namely going to jobs and making money, depends on the real world, which is our second contribution. And thirdly, it is going to be really bad for the economy that will be devoid of real output and value, which is our third contribution. I'm going to firstly talk about the opening government, and then I'm going to talk about the opening opposition. But very quickly, I just want to weigh our crypto extension, our economy extension, because my partner didn't have time for that. I think that we're winning with this extension on at least two metrics. The first one is severity. We are proposing you the most acute impacts on things you could be doing and investing in otherwise. That is to say that there is a direct trade-off between spending money in this virtual reality and spending money on other things. If there is a high risk of losing that money in the virtual reality, if there is a high risk of losing money in Metaverse, that means that we are the only one team in this debate that literally says why people are likely to lose jobs, why people are likely to be worse off in the real life when it comes to their livelihoods, rather than some fluffy impacts that other teams try to argue in this debate. The second one is obviously certainty. Lots of impacts in this debate are extremely speculative and based on hypotheses about what the world will look like. I think that this is literally the whole idea from the opposition. Like, this is just an assumption that this is, like all of these opportunities are going to be provided by Metaverse. We do not know that. We are proposing you a tangible material impact on real people, and I think that this is the reason as to why you should be weighing this heavily. Let's go to the open government. I think that we are weighing over open government for a very simple reason. Their explanation of why regulation will not happen is basically people do not comprehend this technology and they will learn too slowly. We think this is a generic explanation for regulating any kind of technology. The same kind of reasons can be given as to why regulating self-driving cars is difficult or using machine learning is difficult. We think that we are the only one team in this debate that proposes specific reasoning as to why regulating Metaverse is going to be problematic, namely legislative influence of Facebook, incentives and capacity of Facebook for regulatory capture, the fact that it is so addictive and immersive, as everyone in this debate agrees, that it is going to be even more difficult to create pressure for that. As weighed already in the extension, without explaining as to why regulating this is going to be so difficult, the open government cannot claim like the majority of the impacts that they try to claim. And we also have the other impacts that I'm going to talk about that I think are going to weigh more heavily over the open government, namely the impacts connected to economics that I have already explained as to why they're more important. When it comes to the opposition side, so both of the opening opposition side as well as the closing opposition side have this case when they, have many beautiful benefits that just seem too good to be true. And while we concede technology might be getting to that level of advancement at some point, their burden is to prove that people in control of these technologies will really create these versions that they are talking about. Will really create the best version that possibly can be created. We think that there are two possible scenarios. A, they don't create that because they don't see a potential to make money of that. They don't see a reason as to why people should be more empathetic, no reason why we should simulate different policies, and so on and so forth. Note panel that these companies are unlikely to benevolently share this technology with others. A, per their own analysis, it creates massive profit, so they have no reason not to do that. The second thing, basically to share that with other companies. They don't want to share the profit. That's what I'm saying. Second thing is that the business model of Metaverse, as per the CEO analysis, must rely on the network effect. This is to say you can only get money if you have millions of users, because this optimizes data collection, allows this to be free, and so on and so forth. As such, it is likely to be controlled in a monopolistic manner. As such, this means Facebook is not going to share this with other companies. So they have no reason to do that, and they are also not going to share that with other companies. But second of all, there is another scenario when they do implement these fantastic technologies because they see a reason as to how they can make money out of this. And even if it creates some benefits, here is a couple of responses as to why we should disregard these benefits altogether. First of all, as everybody agrees, they're going to be so immersive, so addictive. But escapism is not great because people still need to go to work and make money. Note panel that CEO did not engage with that, or didn't really engage with that either. The illusion of having a better life is still an illusion. No answer to the fact that you still need to live real life from the opposition is, in my opinion, something that makes them lose this debate. What is really important is that they cannot just assume that this virtual reality is one-to-one the same as the real world. We think that there is going to be a trade-off. If you practice empathy in virtual reality, you don't do that in real life. If you have a doctor consultation in the virtual reality, it is probably not happening in the real life. Even if the level of transfer from virtual reality to real reality is high, it is not 100%. This means we are going to leave lots of people out. This looks like people being told, oh, you face racism, maybe go to Metaverse. You don't have friends, maybe go to Metaverse. And these people are going to be left out. And I'm going to explain that further, but I want to take a POA from all.
In the same way as GovBench is aware of issues such as dissociation and cognitive dissonance, it's likely there will be wide societal awareness about this, similarly to documentaries about harms of social media which exist today. This means gov harms are mitigated, and people who use this are the ones who need this as opposed to the real world.
Fantastic. But if you are correct in describing these benefits are so life-changing for these people, it is likely that these people are going to know that Facebook basically exploits them, but they're still going to use these technologies. And as a result of that, the people that are going to be using this are not people that really, really need it, but rather people that just think, well, it's a good way out. It's an easy way out. It's something that is so immersive that lots of people are going to think in this way, even though it might not necessarily be true. So while these problems are going to persist, it will make it even more difficult to regulate because the kind of data gathered will be even more complex. The only response that we get from both of the opposition side is that politicians want to regulate that there is a need to gather buy-in. We have explained in so many ways why, first of all, people are bad at predicting future consequences. Second of all, this is like an interesting, fun, immersive thing, so people might be giving it a benefit of doubt. And second of all, why there are structural reasons as to why regulation is extremely difficult. I think that with that being said, they don't really prove the most important thing, which is that the really life impacts are going to be terrible when it comes to economy, when it comes to people making suboptimal life decisions, when it comes to people's livelihoods. And this is the very reason as to why we're winning this debate. Very proud to propose.
All right, thank you very much. I now like to invite the op-whip to conclude the entire debate. Here.
Hi, can I be heard?
Yep.
Great. I'll take BYs in chat. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The overture from government has been that Facebook is addictive, but what they don't understand is that physical reality is also addictive. And I want you to genuinely think about it. You're stuck in your physical reality, and the majority of history has been the pursuit of escape from it. We have been increasingly trying to avoid it for the reason that it is a tyranny over our bodies, and the fact that we are forced to go to our terrible social services, whether it be school, whether it be our jobs, and the fact that we are offered a choice is an opportunity that we should not slip past. 3 things in this speech. First of all, an illustration as for why the majority of government's benefits are insolvent, but moreover worsen on their side. Secondly, an illustration for why our case wins a debate on a metric of utility and on a metric of making people happy. And thirdly, why we are uniquely analytically prior to opening opposition. First of all, why government bench implodes. First of all, they say our burden is that people in control of these technologies will provide these technologies. And they say this as a response to OO. What I think they don't understand is that our analysis uniquely provides the reasons for why, even barring regulation, there are self-motivated incentives for them to provide this technology, even if for the very basic reason that governments don't force them to do it. It is first of all that they do make money from these things, whether it be the contracts that they get with governments, but secondly, the fact that you're providing these services improves the dependence that people have on it, and thirdly, it's a chance to advertise and convince investors that your company is more stable. So there is very clearly an incentive for them to do this, which is why we overtake the first response that they have for us. Our point is not hinged on proper regulation, but at the incentive to reduce utility of people on the ground and make things worse runs counter to the networking effects necessary to convince people to come on. If people come out with disassociation, mental disorder, and illness, this is a persuasive reason for the proliferation to be unsuccessful, which is precisely why they would have an incentive to not do these things, even absent this regulation. So I think the first is that the majority of their points about lacking regulation is totally insolvent for the very basic reason that even without this regulation, none of the actual outcomes change. Secondly, they say, well, there's all this stuff about cryptocurrency. The easy way of response to it is that if they have such extensive regulation over governments, they just won't use crypto because they can force governments to let them use a currency. So that argument's immediately out of the debate. So then, why is opening government out of this debate? First of all, I think opening government doesn't actually compare to the real world, where all their harms could just as easily apply insofar as we explain that political and private institutions screw you over too. But what we specifically illustrate is that if there is some harm of addiction, this addiction incentive gets conclusively worse for the very basic reason that since Facebook doesn't have a compelling reason to keep you on for more than a few minutes at a time, they have an incentive to massively amplify the instant gratification and the echo chambers that you have. Whereas if this can act as a substitute for physical reality, they don't have to force you to stay on because you will come to stay on of your own volition if they provide a service that is good enough, as opposed to being forced to provide instant gratification because the limitations of Facebook is that they are merely an app. So it's for this reason then that opening government and closing government are both out of this debate on a metric of utility and just proving their outcomes. But finally then, there's some stuff about personal problems and extensive apathy, which will lead into the second point. The first is about you ignoring your personal problems. This is not real. First, who's to say the metaverse isn't real? For some people, this could very well be real and they could extract genuine happiness from it. I think it's a weird value judgment for them to say just because it's not physical doesn't mean it doesn't mean things to people. Secondly, this acts as an important pressure valve. The illusion of a better life is valuable to deal with the stresses of the present day life, and forcing people to go to terrible jobs and then just deal with it because somehow they'll emotionally handle it is not a good solution for people, especially when they may just very well break down. We think the comparative is that letting them have a break from this thing would be genuinely valuable to the development as people, as well as give them hope for the future. But thirdly and beyond that is that we also just don't see why people would react to seeing bad things out in the world with empathy. First of all, if you forcefully expose people to hate and anger 24/7 to convince them that solutions should happen, many people overcorrect. And in fact, many bad things are caused by the growing anxieties and fears of people, which is why it may not lead to the positive outcomes of opening government. Even if you fix the empathy gap, it may still lead to things like populism and nationalism, where people turn to extreme solutions to try and rectify for this anxiety rather. Moreover, just because there is some empathy doesn't mean they come to the correct solution. Like, many people agree poverty is a problem, but they disagree on the solution, like how much redistribution to give. Many conservative people think we shouldn't do any redistribution because that would worsen poverty, right? So it's not clear that they actually solve these problems, and in fact may very well worsen them. Okay, that ends the point on government bench, and it's clear that uniquely on the material we provide of just giving better social services, of allowing more social mobility, of improving the economic mobility of people, and allowing for people to form their identities in ways that are meaningful for them, we simply outweigh them on a metric of utility. Before that, I'll take a POI from opening government. Go.
We explain how people in conservative societies will not experiment out of concern for data leaks. But even if that's not the case, since you cannot live in this world 24/7, it's better to form relationships with real people as support to validate your identity, things like pride clubs, and there are still online support groups that exist.
But these are real people. And you're saying that they're not real people, despite the fact that you're interfacing with a real person on the other end. The fact that makes it more real is that you can touch them, that you can say hi to them, and exist in a somewhat physical or at the very least tangible space, even if it's not the real space that you're determining value subjectively. Beyond that, if there are some concerns about data leaks, that's precisely another reason for why there would be some regulation, undercutting your benefit or your harm somewhat. Okay, the rest of the speech will be dedicated to how we overtake opening opposition. CG correctly says that benefits only occur in opening opposition if the metaverse was benevolent. And what we explain is that there are self-incentivized motivations from Metaverse to get government contracts and have private companies pay, because we already proved it's cheaper than physical building, physical spaces and so on, and we expand social mobility. By virtue of the existence of the Metaverse, even without the use of the Metaverse in particular ways, the existence of it improves economic productivity for individuals on the ground and improves social mobility in a way that we think substantially improves the quality of life that they have. Why is this massive? The first reason for why on its own it's enough to weigh over opening opposition is, first of all, because it illustrates a more proximate benefit to the lives of individuals. It is somewhat speculative whether or not they will directly benefit from these policies, especially as government says governments are already quite captured heavily by these corporations. But what we think uniquely affects people on the ground is their ability to improve their lives in a way that is meaningful to them. That is, get a better job because they don't have to physically drive there, or at the very least, they are more likely to be hired because governments or companies don't have to spend so much on paying for land, and so on. Secondly, though, we also illustrate that our material is analytically prior for the very basic reason that, aside from the fact that it's just easier to believe because it's more mutually exclusive. Like, you can still, again, I think this pointed out, you can have simulations without, Metaverse. What we specifically illustrate is that the existence of a physical space to facilitate social interactions is valuable to many things in people's lives, such as being able not just to have friends and form your own identity, but even to basically work, learn things, and so on. And the fact that you could do this with some Zoom calls is not a substitute for the fact that it would be substantially better if you had it in a physical space that could substitute for many of these things. And the fact that people are clamoring for physical debating should be proof enough that having something closer to physical debating would be a substantial improvement over it, especially in terms of economic productivity and the ability for people to improve their own lives. By and large, at the end of the speech, we illustrate something very basic to the core of this debate, that physical reality is something that is heavily addictive for many people on the ground, and that the presentation of an alternative, even if it may be somewhat bad or imperfect, substantially improves the quality of both, which is why closing opposition is proud to advance. Negate.